welcome back to Consumer Says. My name is Sophia. I'm here with Morning Consult Intelligence and my co-host Kayla. How are you doing, Kayla?
I'm pretty good. How are you, Sophia?
I'm good. This is our last episode of 2024, so it's been fun to have, we just started this podcast. I think we have 5 or 6 episodes out, but it's been fun going on this journey, but we're closing out the year. And if everyone wants to go back and check out our previous podcast, we did a preview for 2025. But today we're going to focus mostly on tariffs, which I think will be a big theme of 2025. We don't really know what's going to happen with the tariffs, what tariff plan will be executed from what was proposed on the campaign trail. But what we do have the ability to do is ask consumers what they think about it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm excited to talk about it and just excited to close out the year. It's the holiday season, so looking forward to that.
And tariffs, of course, play very broadly into the bigger discussion that Sophia and I are always thinking about, which is inflation. And with this episode coming out on Fed Day, they'll be announcing whether they're holding or cutting rates. It's very top of mind for us and for many other people in the economy right now. What is happening with inflation? Of course, the other part of the Fed's dual mandate, as Sophia likes to remind us on previous episodes, is the labor market. That's the other thing that I think they're going to be looking at very closely. So a lot of the time I do the temperature check. I thought today maybe Sophia can assign a temperature to the labor market. What would you say, Sophia, is the temperature of the labor market today?
Well, for the labor market, there's two ways to look at it. So there's a point in time temperature at this very moment, and there's also a seasonality, a directionality. I
Mhm.
think when we look at where we are today, all measures are pretty good, especially when we look at historical levels for the unemployment rate, hiring, and job openings. But when we look at the trend, there has been a cooling off. So we saw unemployment has been kind of hobbling around back and forth. It was going up slowly, ticking up slowly, 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 and then we got a couple months of relief, but it did tick up again last month. So that one's a little bit more, it's pretty good. It's like 4.2%. That's pretty tight when you look at historical, but it is up from when it was at its lows. And then we have other measures of jobs like hiring rate and job openings, and those have kind of slowed significantly, especially the hiring rate. So I think for the overall worker, most people who want a job have a job if you think about 4% unemployment rate, and those people are doing pretty good. Kayla and I benchmark 70 degrees Fahrenheit as the ideal temperature. So I would say it's a little tiny bit cool from ideal, but with the caveat that it's maybe a 68 heading into the fall where we're moving in a cooler direction, things are cooling down, and I do think the temperature is quite cold, or at least colder, for people who don't have a job, because a lot of the softening we're seeing right now is coming from people who are looking for a job. So it's more of been a slowdown in terms of creating new jobs or hiring people rather than, mass layoffs or mass unemployment. What do you
Yeah,
think of that?
I totally agree with that. And it feels it's hard to remember sometimes because there have been so many metrics that have been moving in a cooling direction. And it's definitely the ones on the hiring side and sort of the new labor demand side that have had the most dramatic cooling compared to unemployment. But yeah, the fact is it's still very low, the unemployment rate. So it really is just kind of a tale of two workers. If you have lost your job or left your job or are entering the workforce, it might be a little chilly. But yeah, like you said, for the most part, there's not a ton of fear about among workers of losing their jobs imminently. So it seems pretty stable if you are hired or if you're already a job holder.
Maybe I'll revise it down to 65 actually, because after
Already it's moved. You were right. Directionally, it's slipping lower.
I do think it will continue to slip down lower. I don't think it will happen quickly, although that could change depending on whatever happens in the new year. That could change from any shock or just like changes in the economy. So something to keep our eyes on.
And with Fed decisions, which we'll get back to at the end of this episode, I think maybe check in what some of the implications there could be for what their decision is today.
Yeah, stay tuned for a little Fed discussion at the end. But that actually brings us to our next topic, which is this tariff survey. So I do think a big part of our lives in the econ world and discussions will be centering around tariffs because that is a large part of the incoming presidential administration's economic plan, and there is a lot of uncertainty on how that will be implemented, what sectors and companies it will impact the most, how it will be different from different countries because there have been a variety of different proposals thrown around multiple times. Will there be a higher tariff on China versus Mexico and Canada, or is it going to be broad based, just all countries? So that's something that we don't really have the information on. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, what we can do here is ask consumers what they think. And we do have plans for asking about tariffs early next year in Q1 as well. So I'm really curious to see how this might change over time as the tariff plan becomes more concrete, and if it does go into effect and prices do pass on to consumers, how that might also change their perspective and thoughts about things. But before we talk about the change, let's talk about where we're starting. It would be interesting to go back and listen to this episode when the tariff plan is finally revealed and ultimately implemented. But Kayla, so can you give us an overview of what were the main findings? What do consumers think about tariffs, and where are we at today in terms of sentiment on tariffs?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think we were really curious about understanding with this tariff survey was given the fact that, we survey adults 18 and up. So most of that survey group, that sample, is of age where they would remember the last time that Trump was in office implementing tariffs in 2018. And so one thing I was really curious about, and I think we as a group were pretty curious about, was given that experience, that lived experience, how does that influence views today? And so sort of that was kind of a benchmark that we wanted to look at. And for the most part, consumers looking back did remember those tariffs, and they thought their costs went up, because we're really interested in how consumers feel about the tariffs. Do they support them or not? And then if they do support them, given that, a lot of voters voted for Trump and many of those support the tariffs, at the same time, we've seen a lot of dislike about inflation among those same voters. We're trying to understand, how we get there, sort of how we close the loop on that.
And anecdotally, I've gotten a lot of questions about there's kind of a disconnect because a lot of these companies are at least saying that they will pass costs on to consumers, which will raise prices. But there's also this big narrative and explanation for why Trump won the election was that people are so unhappy with inflation and high prices. So there is a disconnect there. So that's kind of part of the motivation of just trying to understand what people actually think about tariffs, or what they even understand a tariff to be.
Exactly. And it actually seemed like a lot of consumers are pretty clear-eyed about companies' plans to pass on these costs. More consumers than not said, yeah, we think that the companies will pass on these costs, and they'll pass on a pretty large share of these costs, not really holding back. So consumers overall seem aware that their costs could increase from the tariffs. They remember it happening in 2018, and they believe that these tariffs, which most of the proposals, again, we don't know where we'll land, but most of the proposals that have been mentioned are more significant than the ones in 2018. Consumers seem to know that. They think that these plans on net will have a bigger impact on their costs. And more consumers than not say it could be bad for my finances, it could be bad for inflation, meaning it'll make inflation higher. What's really interesting to me is that over the last few years, inflation attitudes have been kind of gone through the ringer. Like, consumers have been really struggling. They've hated inflation so much. And so it's a very different environment now than it was in 2018 when these tariffs were implemented. So it seems kind of like already consumers are so fed up with where prices are, and yet there was acceptance for new prices to be added on. And what's interesting is especially for some of the kind of lower number tariffs, like 10%, even across all countries, which is really a very large magnitude of tariffs. On net, consumers actually are potentially supportive of that, which I thought was interesting. When it comes to things like tariffs on Canada, there's less net support, and also higher percentage tariffs, there's less support. So I thought that was interesting too. It seems like there's kind of an unclear idea of maybe for some reason it's worth it to do tariffs, but if they're not too high, it won't be that bad.
It is interesting to me that people seem to, in general, believe that the 2018 tariffs raised prices at least somewhat, but I do suspect that maybe that could be the reason why the 10% tariff is getting a little bit more support because I think there's a little bit of a false equivalence between the 2018 tariffs and the tariffs that are proposed now because they're actually very different in terms of the broad-based impact of what goods would be placed a tax on. So in 2018, it was much more targeted and it did raise prices for some of those goods that had tariffs, but it wasn't really a broad-based 10% flat tariff. So maybe people are seeing this 10% and not really realizing that it's quite different than what was actually done in 2018 and maybe they did see somewhat of effect from those tariffs, but they thought it was marginal. So maybe that's why. I don't know. It's kind of hard to reconcile these differences.
It is, but I think that's a great point. And one thing that we found that I think kind of supports your theory, Sophia, is when we asked a question about specific categories that were, are would consumers be in favor of raising tariffs on these specific categories? And for certain things like groceries and food, things like that, household paper products, things that you're buying all the time, there was a lot of net opposition to raising tariffs on those categories. But for some things that maybe consumers didn't buy as often, like new vehicles or something like that, there was a little bit less concern about raising tariffs. Most of them on net were opposed because consumers were thinking, no, I don't want to pay more for these things. But it seemed like some of the categories that they had either not that they don't buy as frequently, things like electronics or new vehicles, there was less concern about adding tariffs there. And I think that ties into your point because it may be that consumers remember washing machines getting more expensive, or at least reading about washing machines getting more expensive. It was just sort of a more limited, targeted set of goods that were impacted by the categories in 2018. And this time it could be more broad based, especially, with certain imports from Mexico and things like that. There are some food categories there, and it looks like consumers are pretty resistant to paying more for those.
Yeah, and that's why I'm really curious to see how the survey results change over the next year because with the proposed plan on Mexico and Canada, we import over 30% of our fruits and vegetables from Mexico and Canada. So that will definitely have an effect on the market for produce for Americans. And that could really anger them, and that they could actually feel that faster than maybe they would feel the price change for a washing machine, which is something you only buy every once in a while. But I wonder also if it's not just what people buy more frequently, but also maybe the idea of bringing back manufacturing to the US. So maybe people see heavier items like cars, vehicles, as something that should be manufactured in the US, and maybe tariffs would help out with industry in the US. So maybe there's some sort of, isn't there some support of tariffs because they believe it helps manufacturing or helps the US economy in that sense?
Yeah, it was interesting because that was another thing we tried to look at with the survey. We looked at we kind of compared how do you think that tariffs would affect your household finances? And then separately, we were like, how do you think tariffs would affect the US economy overall? There still were some concerns around the US economy and certain factors within the US economy, things like inflation, I think people think of as part of the economy, generally thought tariffs will make that worse. But there was definitely more positive views relative to how how it would affect household finances about how it would affect the economy overall. Meaning
Interesting.
that, yeah, compared to it did seem like there might be a little bit of willing willingness for personal sacrifice for the sake of the economy overall. That being said, overall views on how it would help the economy were not very clear. And
Mhm.
there was, in certain ways it seemed like consumers thought it would help. A lot of the beneficiaries actually that were sort of, drifted to the top in the survey results, according to consumers, they seemed to think it would help corporate profits and politicians to some extent. But obviously there are people in there who support tariffs, and those that did have more positive views of how they believed it would help the US economy.
Mhm. Interesting. So, also another thing that you have done research on is how some of the tariff goods are related to our price sensitivity index. So, do you want to talk about that? And maybe let's take a couple steps back for people who don't aren't familiar with their price sensitivity index and give an overview of what that is. Also, if you really want to get into that, we have our second episode ever. We talk about the supply chains and inflation index, break it down in a more in-depth conversation. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out. But let's start with a brief overview of the price sensitivity index and what does that have to do with tariffs?
Yeah, so price sensitivity, and this was an indicator that loomed very large in my mind as I was looking through the tariff survey results. The price sensitivity index is one of our indexes really tracking how consumers sort of change their behavior in response to prices. And this one specifically is tracking how much consumers are walking away from a purchase that they considered because the price was higher than expected. So that's how we kind of define price sensitivity for our index. And what was interesting, going back to that survey question I told you about, where we asked about specific types of goods and services, net support for tariffs was negatively correlated with how much price sensitivity had increased. Meaning the more for across the different goods that we asked about. So for the goods that have over the past couple years, as inflation has been pretty high, for the goods categories that consumers have been like most increasingly price sensitive about, including groceries, things like that, um, there is the least support for raising tariffs, which makes sense. People are like, we're already fed up with these prices for these specific goods the most. Another interesting trend that we looked at when we compare the survey findings on tariffs to our price sensitivity data is actually across different income groups. Um, Something that surprised me a little bit was that higher income adults in general were a little bit more accepting of tariffs. Sometimes on net they were more supportive. Middle and lower income adults really were not. And that aligns very well with kind of the story we've seen with price sensitivity over the last few years. High income adults, as we've talked about a lot, Sophia and I, have been less price sensitive, more willing to spend. Lower income adults consistently not. The middle income group, especially over the last year or so, has really had an increase in price sensitivity and really kind of a deterioration in their willingness to spend. That has kind of corresponded pretty closely with attitudes on tariffs, given that they're expecting that these could add more inflation.
Interesting. Yeah, those higher income consumers have just generally had more willingness to spend on things. And we also had another memo that came out, and over the past year, especially, high income consumers in particular have lower price sensitivity for goods that are a little more um, fun and discretionary than their lower earning peers, like going out to eat or going on vacation, which makes a lot of sense because they're just willing to maybe fork out extra money. They have that wiggle room in their budget. But it is interesting to see in our data just how middle income consumers have kind of deteriorated more over the past year and are feeling a little bit more similar to our lower income consumers. So basically, middle and what you're saying is middle and low income consumers are a little bit more worried about how tariffs might affect the prices, especially
Yeah.
for the goods that they're more price sensitive for.
Yes, exactly. And actually, now that I think about it, there also could be a services versus goods component there because, of course, the things we asked about, the things that are most likely, most directly impacted by tariffs, for the most part, would be goods. And higher income consumers, a lot of their sort of discretionary spending is on services, as you were mentioning. So they might be thinking, oh, well, all this stuff that I have room in my budget for, is not even going to be affected by that, and less worried about, the goods prices.
They're probably, yeah, probably just less worried about everyday goods prices compared to someone who has a tighter budget. That makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. Okay, well, is there anything else that you want to talk about on tariffs or inflation, or should we move on to the Fed?
I think we should talk about the Fed.
Okay, so when this episode comes out, as Kayla mentioned earlier, the Fed will be making its decision later today. So maybe by the time you're watching this, they've already made their decision. We don't want to speculate too much on what they're going to do. There's actually a little bit more uncertainty, I would say, for this meeting than past meetings. The Fed has kind of hinted at a potential for a rate pause, at least in the future, but markets still really expect them to cut by 25 basis points. So if they do end up pausing in December, that will maybe send some shockwaves in the markets because they seem pretty certain about the cut. But if they do end up following through with the cut, they are likely to probably at least hint at future rate pause in the new year. But what do you think? What do you think about the Fed in 2025, Kayla? We didn't talk about it too much in our 2025 preview, but they could have an interesting year coming up for them.
Yeah, I think that they're in a bit of a dilemma for reasons including things like the tariffs, which are going to, I mean, right now there's a lot of uncertainty because we don't even know what the tariffs will look like, what will actually go into effect, when it will go into effect. Um, but things like that, as we've talked about a lot, could have a big impact on inflation, which is the thing that they're really trying to fight here. And something that we've been sprinkling into our analysis a little bit is that there are these kind of mounting inflation risks. So I think that there are definitely some factors that the Fed is getting nervous about, especially given the fact that Fed policy takes a while to kind of filter through to the economy fully. So their decision today is going to still potentially have impacts a few months from now when conditions have changed. So uncertainty on the prices side, including from things like policy risk, but also things like reheating goods prices a little bit, maybe potentially supply chains tightening up a little less help on the goods side that we've, talked about a little in some of our writings. Also, higher wage growth on services industries, it's actually been picking up a little bit. So there's a bunch of like little percolating factors that maybe haven't reversed a lot of progress on inflation, but are maybe threatening to reverse progress
Yeah.
on inflation.
I think it's important to know, even not even thinking about tariffs, not even thinking about policies that could go into effect in 2025, the Fed is kind of working against an inflation that's a little bit more sticky than it seemed like it was going to be a few months ago. And as you mentioned, goods prices might not be helping that top line inflation number as much as it used to. That could get worse with tariffs, but it's already kind of starting to heat up a little bit. And then we have housing, which, as we mentioned in our last episode, we don't see housing resolving itself magically in the next few months. So that will continue to be a pain in the side of the Fed and bringing inflation down. But then we also have these other downside risks of will these tariffs be implemented and will they at least provide a temporary spike in inflation again? And then other policies could also cause an impact, like, um, you know, cutting taxes could add some fiscal stimulus and reheat the economy again.
And then at the same time, we have the labor market that they so desperately want to protect. And it's already, according to Sophia, cooled 1 degree just over the course of this podcast. So, I mean, but really though, we're very fortunate to not have had to see mass layoffs so far
Yeah.
with how high interest rates have been. So, the Fed would like to maintain what strength is left in the labor market, not see it weaken further.
There's a narrative that I'm kind of seeing from Fed communications of, I think earlier in the summer it was maybe it's time now to focus more on the labor market than inflation because the labor market appears to be cooling more than they expected while inflation is approaching target. But in the past quarter, that's kind of flipped a little bit back to maybe they're weighed evenly. Maybe inflation's starting to overtake the labor market again in terms of concern for the Fed, and so that could really change their policy rate and the plan for future rate cuts going into the new year, which could, we could see that trickle down to people. We could see that trickle down to the labor market. We could see that trickle down to the economy as a whole.
Yeah. And regardless of the decision today, I don't think these problems are going to go away. So we will keep watching these things as we resume our podcast in 2025.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for a great 2024. I'm really excited to see what is in store for us in 2025. Hopefully, good things. But thanks so much for everything and happy holidays, everybody.